President Zelensky has told Putin that if he wants Kursk back so bad, he can just trade for it. Are we going back to middle school Pokemon cards? Is this a sign of Ukrainian weakness, or is this just a negotiating tactic? Plus, we're going to take a look at North Korea providing even more sophisticated systems to the Russians, and of course, the Secretary of Defense dropping the hammer on European allies. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of it. Okay, so this is, I think, one of the most interesting stories here. Zelensky has said that, if Putin wants his land so back, his land in Kursk back so bad, he can trade for it, right? Now, again, some of this is Zelensky playing in between, sort of trying to navigate a tight spot where he wants to signal to the U.S. that, I'm willing to negotiate. I have all options on the table. That's something that President Trump has said repeatedly, that he wants to see both sides willing to sit down. And Zelensky's goal is to signal to the U.S., hey, I'm willing to sit down. I'm willing to consider everything. I'm not the problem here. And again, those of you that have been following this channel know that for at least 2 years, the Ukraine has been doing exactly that. They've actually tried to put together a peace conference. They've invited many Russian allies like China and Brazil. And Russia has been the one to tell them to go pound sand. Russia wants to see a military victory, and they believe they can achieve it. Now, so Zelensky has to say that, but he also doesn't want to give Russia a sense that they are going to be able to extract something, or that his stance is softening, right? And frankly, this is saying only the quiet part out loud, right? This is something where the Ukrainian operation in Kursk was always about just annexing territory that can be exchanged for Ukrainian territory in the future. That was the whole intent, right? And yes, there was some tongue-in-cheek like, oh, it's now the Free Kursk Republic, but that was clearly, anyone with a brain knows that this was clearly done not in order to actually expand Ukrainian dominion, but simply to hold something that can be traded off later. So I think this is just a sign and a symbol by Zelensky to say, listen, everything has always been on the table, right? And this is true of any negotiation. Everybody pretends like, oh, that's off the table. But the truth is, if it's physically possible, it's at least on the table. And the idea, again, is to convince the Trump administration that their coercion doesn't need to be placed on Ukraine. It needs to be placed on Russia. But that might be a harder task than we think. But first, I wanted to give you guys a word from our sponsor. Did you know that a quick internet search can reveal shocking amounts of your personal information? Your full name, home address, personal email, phone number, even information about your relatives is all out there for anyone to find. I recently looked up my mom's name, and even though she barely uses the internet, her age, address, phone number, and other sensitive details were easily accessible. It's unsettling to realize how exposed we all are. This happens because of data brokers, companies that collect and sell your personal information to robocallers, telemarketers, spammers, and other bad actors looking to exploit your data. That's why I'm glad to partner with today's sponsor, Aura. Aura scans the web to identify which data brokers are exposing your information and automatically submits opt-out requests on your behalf. They'll even reduce junk mail and telemarketing calls so you don't have to deal with them. You can check out how many data brokers have your information right now by using my link, aura.com/combat. Try it free for 2 weeks and see just how much of your private data is floating around. The link is in the description, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. Aura does more than just remove your data from broker lists. It also monitors your emails and passwords to see if you've been exposed in any hacks, or see if your sensitive information is out on the dark web. For example, Aura found my personal information had been exposed in the Equifax hack 8 years ago, which means that if I wasn't careful, someone would use it against me. Beyond that, Aura is an all-in-one security solution. It comes with a VPN, password manager, real-time credit and identity theft monitoring, internet parental controls, and even malware protection for your devices. It's basically a full internet safety suite in one easy-to-use app. Let Aura handle the heavy lifting of keeping you and your personal data safe. Sign up today using my link, and you'll get a free 2-week trial, and you can see just how much of your personal data is exposed. Trust me, you'll be surprised. Go to aura.com/combat to start your free trial. It's linked below, or you can scan the QR code to get started. So, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that he is ruling out NATO membership for Ukraine and says Europe must be responsible for the country's security. Now, I want to point out that this is not actually a big variation from current U.S. policy, right? The U.S. has actually been one of 3 countries voting to not include Ukraine as a NATO member. And again, I think this is actually... this has been the case for 10 years, right? There has been this dynamic that's played out where Ukraine has explicitly said, we want to become NATO members. And in turn, NATO has said, we foresee you eventually becoming NATO members, but obviously we can't do it now while your country is occupied, right? Because again, a country at war, which remember, it's been since 2014, since the Euromaidan protests, that Ukraine has been fighting in at least the occupied Donbas against the separatists. So NATO said, listen, we respect the fact that you want to join us. We'd love to have you when you get your stuff together, right? Kind of like that crazy cousin who's like going through some stuff and you're like, listen, dude, get through your thing and then we'd be happy to have you come visit. But we know if you came now, you'd bring a bunch of drama and your crazy friends with you. So just sort your stuff. And that's been the policy for literally a decade. And so the fact is that the U.S. is saying, listen, we're going to resolve this strategic ambiguity. But this is also, there might be a little bit of a strategic play here. Because look, there's so many people who have told Putin, yo, listen, who have said Putin invaded because NATO was about to surround poor Russia, except for the Caucasus and all of Eastern Russia. But they're totally going to be surrounded on one side, right? But why then would Putin continue to fight if the U.S. Secretary of Defense has just ruled out NATO membership, right? Like, and again, if you follow this channel, you know that we've covered this extensively. Putin himself has never alluded to NATO being the problem, NATO surrounding them, Ukraine becoming a NATO member. No, he's relied on total acts of fiction. For example, the biolabs or some kind of neo-Nazi government when, again, in fact, it's kind of weird that a country of neo-Nazis would elect a Jewish president. Weird. But again, non-facts, total Putinist fiction. And of course, you also have on the other side, Putin's just his claims that says it's ours because it should be. And it's self-evident that Ukraine is meant to be a satellite of Russia. So what you instead have is this act by the Secretary of Defense saying, listen, Ukraine is not a NATO member. It has not been imminently facing NATO membership. In fact, Putin's act of seizing the Donbas basically precluded NATO membership. So then you ask yourself, why is Putin still fighting if the dangerous NATO surrounding them? Now, again, I think it's pretty embarrassing to rule it out because, again, it signals to other countries that NATO can be deterred by one country, one very committed country like Russia. Actually, Russia isn't even that committed, right? There's no general draft. So that it may signal to potential other adversaries that unless you're a true developing country, I mean a Mali, an Afghanistan, a country with just no industry to speak of, NATO will absolutely beat you into the dirt. But if you're any country with any kind of industrial base, NATO will basically cave and cower in the face of even, again, a trivially equipped country like Russia, right? Compared to the collective military might of NATO. And so the other statement from Secretary of Defense Hegseth that I thought was interesting, right? Again, the actual quote I want to point out is the United States does not believe NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. I think that might be true, right? And he said that other security guarantees offered to Ukraine must be backed by capable European and non-European troops, right? To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. And this is, of course, really tough because, again, now you have to have the Europeans not just sign off on a peace deal, but commit to an indefinite commitment of their troops, of EU troops, on this line. And boy, that is hard. That is a tough one because, you know, the EU hates threats, but they also hate defending themselves. They're like the smallest, barkiest dog you've ever seen. They hate the fact that big dogs are around and they go, dog, bark, 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 big dog, bark, bark. But you're like, okay, you have teeth, you have paws, right? It's like a puppy who learns to be scared, and then they grow into a big dog, but they still act like they're a tiny puppy, right? That's kind of what Europe is. They are a huge trade bloc. They're 250 million people, an economy the size of the United States, yet a defense industrial complex that falters when asked to do something, equip one small country in a regional war. And, right, Hesketh also pointed out, he said, we're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe, right? This is not a surprise to the U.S.'s allies who point out that, again, China is a country that is very actively views itself as the United States adversary, has an economy the size of the United States, and the United States can no longer, right? In the 90s, there was basically the United States and there was a whole bunch of second world countries, right? There was just the US and everybody else was a tier below. Not so anymore, right? This is a multipolar world, and a multipolar world means that you can't be the world police. And that's okay. But it means that it's going to be very hard, right? And the fact is that even the NATO Secretary General says that he agrees with Trump that, quote, we must equalize security assistance to Ukraine, but to really change the trajectory of the conflict, we need to do even more. And I think this is true, right? And the other thing that the defense secretary said is, listen, NATO, you have to protect yourselves. You have to spend on your own defense. And this is, unfortunately, just a reality that European countries have to confront. That it's true. The U.S. cannot financially counter every single threat across the globe. And so the Europeans do have a responsibility. Now, what also bothers me, as we've talked about on this channel extensively, is that the Europeans have had a long lead time. The U.S. has clearly signaled that its aid is extremely contingent, that there are extreme political negotiations to get aid packages through. The extreme delays should have been a signal to Europe that we are buying you 3 years to ramp up your own ability to provide this aid to ensure security in the European continent. And the fact is, the Europeans, every time an aid package is passed, they go, thank God. For a second there, I thought we were going to have to make our own artillery shells. Oh, thank God. For a second, I thought we were going to have to learn how to fucking make a helmet. And you're like, guys, that was not the intent of this. Again, it's like having your degenerate kid. You pay for their rent in an apartment. You go, listen, we're paying for an apartment for a year, so you got to get a job and get your savings together. But then they go, another month. My rich parents are taking care of the rent. I can chill. I don't have to work, right? And so it sucks. And it sucks because, you know, when it's your kid, you get to just laugh at your friend's degenerate kid, right? When it's another country, people are going to die, right? People are going to have to die for Europe to learn that it can't outsource its defense, right? You know, just like there's some things you can't outsource your exercise. It doesn't matter how much your friend exercises, it won't make you healthy. Just like it doesn't matter ultimately how much the Americans spend on defense in the final equation, the final math, that you only have the ability, you can only rely in the final math on yourself for defense and your own priorities. And sometimes you got to have the bottom drop out to learn that, right? Again, this isn't me saying that the U.S. is right to abandon Ukraine. I think our aid that we've provided them has been so small. It's been a rounding error. We've given them old gear that was slated to get sort of rotated out. We've given them training of, that our troops, frankly, training other militaries helps our troops. We've given them intelligence and planning assistance. We've given them a lot of things that are cost the U.S. nothing, that were already purchased. We gave them so many old MRAPs from Afghanistan, so much of this stuff. So, the U.S. has spent so little of its defense budget on Ukraine assistance. But again, I don't think we should stop, but Europe should not have counted on the U.S. to be doing this forever. Now, what I wanted to also talk about, Ukraine. At least one country's learning its lessons. Ukraine's no longer going to create new brigades, according to an official, right? They tried this experiment. They're going to raise new brigades to rotate brigades, again, operating on this brigade rotational structure that's modeled pretty clearly after the United States Brigade Combat Team rotation system. But the U.S. fought for 20 years in a low-intensity conflict in Afghanistan, and that brigade rotation system worked well enough for them. Though I actually argue it didn't work that well at all. Again, look no further than the fact that the U.S. would kill Taliban leadership because they said, well, if we kill their leaders, they'll have to bring in a new leader who won't know anything and they'll run their organizations less effectively. Well, the Taliban never even had to target U.S. leaders because we removed our own leaders by rotating them out every 12 months and then later in the war, every 9 months. Literally, fresh leaders who had never been to the country before or never been to Afghanistan in the role they currently were in were suddenly placed in charge of the war again and again and again and again, right? So the brigade combat team rotation system is kind of shitty, even in a counterinsurgency. But in a full-scale conflict, a war of attrition, brigade rotational systems, garbage. So risky. And that's what they had, right? So instead they said, listen, we're going to do a core system to replace this brigade system. We're going to focus in on strengthening existing brigades operating in combat zones by replenishing them. This is so much better. Now, what has to happen, though, is a cultural shift and a recognition by those brigades that when they get replenished, they have to have a culture that takes new guys under their wing and trains them up. You cannot treat the new guys as being unmotivated dirtbags, even if they kind of are, right? You have to indoctrinate them into your unit culture. You have to train them up to survive. You have to get them into fighting shape. You cannot simply force them to perform the most dangerous tasks and incur the highest casualties, right? You actually have to allow your replenishments to replenish your unit, right? And again, this is something that looks more like the U.S. in Vietnam, where we would deploy a brigade, and that brigade would be headquartered in Vietnam, and soldiers individually would rotate out, but the brigades themselves would remain in country, right? And that meant that you could assign a brigade to a mission. It would have persistent leadership. It rarely had this kind of changes. And remember, Ukraine doesn't really rotate out positions. Everyone is mobilized until the end of the war. So what you end up with is even more accrued experience in these units and even more opportunities for mentorship, unit cohesion, experience to confer its biggest advantages. Now, I want to talk also about North Korea. Why? Because North Korea is also ramping up its support, right? Unlike the United States, who's balking and wavering, right? Russian ally and noted dictatorship, North Korea, is sending 200 long-range artillery systems to Russia, right? This is a part of ongoing arms transfers, but this is also kind of a ramp up. This is, of course, a 160 long-range artillery systems identified as a 170 millimeter self-propelled howitzer, photograph being transported in Russia last month, right? And this is a real... Again, is this a real escalation? Probably. Again, I think this is part of the idea that these artillery units and their crews are going to be trained by the Russians in kind of modern artillery tactics, right? The Russian artillery way of war. And this is part of the trade-off, right, where Pyongyang says, listen, if we're going to have bigger nuclear and conventional missile capabilities, then why not provide some of our artillery systems that Russia badly needs, right? Sanctions have meant that Russia struggles to rebuild its artillery systems, worn out barrels, etc. But the fact is that that Russia is able to offset this disadvantage by simply acquiring the weapon systems from North Korea. And, this is one of the things that I think is a broader sort of caveat that a lot of countries around the globe and a lot of populations around the globe are seeing. What they're seeing is that North Korea, a dictatorship, is able to decisively and effectively help Russia in a committed way, even to the point of taking thousands of casualties. In contrast, right, you have the United States, who, frankly, every couple months has to be begged and pled and cajoled and coerced into providing, again, a greater amount of assistance, but that assistance is harder to plan for because it's so inconsistent. And then you have Europe, who provides, financial assistance, but a lot of European assistance to Ukraine is actually just providing care and shelter to Ukrainians who fled the country, right? So people who Ukraine wants returned. They want them back in their country, working, providing taxes. In a case of 1 million of those men actually, being out there and fighting, as is their legal duty. So this is a really kind of one of those things that's it's just annoying. I don't know what else to tell you, right? Now, okay, I want to caveat this, but I don't usually like the Daily Caller, but it's when they're right, and sometimes they're the only people that report on some of these stories, right? The owner they found of a U.S. defense missile contractor making fighter jets and missile parts is actually listed as a Chinese intelligence official. That's right. Defense contractor that supplies parts for American military aircraft and advises the U.S. government on supply chain security is owned by, an immigrant with extensive ties to the Chinese Communist Party, intelligence, and influence agencies, right? This is, of course, so his company, a Aerospace Metals LLC in New York, that actually sits on the Department of Homeland Security Council on critical manufacturing. Their CEO, Jerry Wang, whose Chinese name is Wang Zhu, has been identified as an official for multiple CCP influence and intelligence organizations within the Chinese government, and state media reports raising concerns about the fact that are we funneling money and allowing Chinese Communist Party members to sit on major U.S. defense security councils? Absolutely insane. Now, he says, I don't have any ties to foreign political entities, but did not deny being photographed at numerous Chinese government and CCP intel agency functions alongside high-ranking party officials, right? Now, again, several of these organizations, right, are identified as being CCP sort of fronts, which is why he is able to say, well, I never engaged with a foreign political entity, but what they are is likely NGOs or Chinese cultural associations or other kind of fronts that are ostensibly entities incorporated in the United States, but are sort of permeated by Chinese officials. And this is just one of those things that, again, there's a lot of talk about the lack of vetting, the lack of security of these contractors. And don't get me wrong, it's something that even Elon Musk, I don't think he's wrong when he identifies these things as real issues, but he's not the first to raise them in government, right? Again, 2 days ago, we looked at a letter from the Inspector General for USAID who said the same thing, who said, listen, we send these payments to people like the UNHCR, and we know that they fund programs in places like the Gaza Strip, but they don't fulfill their requirements to tell us about who the money is actually getting to and whether or not they're affiliated with organizations that U.S. law won't let us fund. And that kind of behavior where U.S. funds, U.S. influence is being diverted to terrorists or to hostile nations, the fact that the U.S. can't see it is insane, right? And I think, but the diagnosis, though, is that the U.S. needs to have a more refined, an improved security and background check process. They need to actually do it holistically, because right now, Literally, they look at some of the stupidest fucking things. They go, oh, how much debt do you have? Like, who gives a shit, dude? This is America. Everybody's in $1 gajillion of debt, right? They look at things like, have you ever been diagnosed with a mental illness, right? It's like, listen, if you work for the Chinese, do you think the Chinese are going to go after somebody with like bipolar? No, dude, that's the last person you want spying for you. You want it to be like this dude, clean as a whistle, never did anything wrong, proud, upstanding member of the not suspicious at all Chinese Overseas Friendship Association, an important platform through which the UFWD co-ops and interacts with overseas United Front figures. Just like, dude, what? Like, can we try to actually audit things? I don't know. Absolute madness. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Thank you to our sponsor. Thanks to James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knudsen, Bastian Himmling, Brian Kelly, Del McCombs, Jan Zola, and Henry Roussier. All of our Lieutenant tier members. Couldn't do it without you guys. Appreciate you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.